What if the making of England did not begin with dominance, but with survival? For much of the early Anglo-Saxon period, Wessex lived in the shadow of Mercia, outnumbered, less prestigious, and frequently on the defensive. It was not the leading kingdom of its age. Yet, it was the one that endured. This documentary begins with that imbalance and asks how Wessex outlasted rivals that seemed stronger by every visible measure. We'll follow the early West Saxon kings, the political consequences of conversion to Christianity, and the development of rules and institutions that bent under pressure rather than breaking. While other kingdoms expanded rapidly and collapsed just as quickly, Wessex absorbed defeat, adapted to crisis, and preserved continuity. In this documentary, we'll trace the long arc from decline to recovery, how moments of weakness forced reform, how authority was reorganized rather than abandoned, and how stability, carefully maintained, proved more durable than raw power. The rise of Wessex was not sudden, and it was not inevitable. Understanding this story is essential to understanding the making of England itself. England was not forged by the most dominant kingdom of its time, but by the one that learned how to survive prolonged second place and turn endurance into advantage. Roman rule in Britain did not fall in a single year. It thinned out. Garrisons left, pay stopped, and the routine that kept roads patrolled and towns supplied slipped away. Town councils lost clout as taxes dried up, workshops fell silent, and trade ships stopped calling at old ports. Without soldiers on retainer, local magnates turned to private guards and household troops. That shift hollowed out urban life and pushed authority into the countryside, where estates could feed warriors and settle debts in cattle, grain, and favors. As coin use faded, trust moved from stamped silver to sworn oaths. Along the eastern and southern shores, a new labor market opened. Ambitious leaders hired fighters from across the North Sea, men used to coastal raiding, river sailing, and quick contracts. Angles, Saxons, and Jutes first came to earn, not to rule. They won pay, then plots, then invitations to send for kin. One inlet led to another. Harbors on the Channel funneled arrivals into estuaries and river mouths, and from there into inland corridors where fields and pasture lay close together. Settling followed service, and service turned into claim. These movements spanned generations. No single host overran the island. Small contingents threaded up river valleys and across chalk uplands where light soils were easy to clear. Paths along the Thames, the Great Ouse, and the Trent carried boats and carts, while ridgeways linked lowland farms to hilltop lookouts. Each season, a few more farmsteads switched hands. A few more alliances reset local balances. Burial grounds tell the story in slow motion. Old rites mixed with new goods. Styles shifted, and naming patterns changed as households blended or moved on. Roman villa life withered in stages. Stone houses went roofless as tiled workshops closed and mosaic floors cracked. Minted coin fell out of daily use. Payment in kind took over. With no imperial bureaucracy to file reports, the role of coordinator passed to war leaders who could summon men by name. Their sway rested on gifts, feasts, and retaliation. A raid answered a raid. A feast sealed a pledge. In the absence of distant oversight, authority looked local and personal, and it traveled with the retinue. Conflict and coexistence ran together. Some native communities pulled back toward the west and north, while older polities held firmer ground. Others struck deals, married across lines, or join new bands under leaders who promised protection and pasture. New settlements clustered around kin ties and obligations to serve on campaign. Fencing and field systems expanded in beads along streams, while hill forts and old Roman sites were reused as mustering points or refuges during bad seasons. Out of this flux, territories began to take shape. Groups that could hold a river crossing or a ridge path for more than a few campaigning years became known for that hold. Names attached to places and peoples. A leader who secured tribute from 3 valleys could claim more than hospitality. He could defend borders and punish trespass. That sense of a defended region planted the early outlines of the kingdoms that later chroniclers would name and rank. By the late 6th century, the balance in much of southern lowland Britain had tilted. Speech, dress, and law favored newcomers and their descendants. Assemblies met in the open to settle injury payments and land disputes. Lords marked out estates that outlived them and passed to heirs. Churches were scarce, but growing. Even before formal conversion, seasonal calendars and communal rites synced labor and service. The Roman chapter had closed without a grand finale, replaced by a mosaic of rising powers, each testing how far a leader's promise and a band of sworn men could reach. Loose blocks of settlement that spread across southern Britain began to set like cooling clay. Fields lined up along streams, pathways linked new farm clusters, and rights over pasture and woodland hardened into expectation. Where a band had held ground for a few campaigning seasons, sons now took over and set markers that outlasted a single leader's fortune. Geography did steady work in shaping this map. The ridges and river loops offered defensible edges, and the best soils drew people to the same places again and again. As neighbors pressed, boundaries mattered, and the first habits of a region emerged from repeated use. Along the upper Thames and across the Chalk Downs to the south, one cluster of Saxon groups found leverage. Light soils broke easily under the plow, springs were reliable, and ridge tracks allowed quick movement between scattered clearings. A foothold here meant more than a safe camp. It meant harvests that could feed followers and store surplus for winter. From that base, influence pushed westward into valleys where smaller communities stood alone, and southward toward coastal corridors that linked markets to inland grain. The settlement rarely walked alone. It moved with spears, and negotiation followed the spears. Later storytellers preferred a clean beginning, a small fleet and a handful of leaders making landfall and naming a people. The real process ran longer and moved in parts. One lineage secured a ford, another held a spur above a meadow, and a third managed a stretch of woodland where swine could fatten. Over decades, marriages stitched these gains together while skirmishes pried open stubborn gaps. Some agreements fixed the peace for a season, others for a generation. When pressure mounted, lines shifted, then settled again in slightly different places, each adjustment teaching the survivors what could be held. No single center called the tune in the early phase. Power clung to men who could feed and pay a retinue, who knew where cattle grazed and where neighbors might raid. A local war leader counted his standing in gifts given and loyalties renewed at feasts. He held a hall, a stretch of fields, and access to a crossing or track. He owed protection to his followers and vengeance when someone tested the edge of his claim. That kind of rule traveled with him and waxed or waned as his fortunes changed. Competition pushed these leaders toward cooperation. Disputes with neighboring Saxon groups and with Brittonic polities to the west and north strained their separate resources. When a raid came along two valleys at once, a lone warband could not cover both approaches. Common ancestry and language made joint musters easier to sell, and shared interests framed meetings where witness and oath settled who owed what to whom. A sense of we grew around routine acts, spring musters, autumn shares of tribute, and the naming of boundaries that more than one group agreed to respect. Control of routes paid off. A leader who could keep a ford clear and safe collected dues and won goodwill. A hall near a chalk ridgeway could pivot men quickly toward a threat while escorting traders without losing time. Fertile loops of the Thames and its feeders yielded grain to fund longer campaigns and support larger bands through lean months. Smaller communities found that joining such a network offered steadier protection than standing alone, and over time, their identities folded into the stronger frame. By the close of the 6th century, the outlines of a kingdom showed through. Not a finished state, but a region with recurring leaders, familiar gathering places, and names that stuck. The web of halls, fields, and routes could bear the weight of decisions that reached beyond a single valley. From this base, future rulers would push custom toward rule, turning that regional dominance into authority that could outlast any one man's arm and voice. Stability changed the job description. Leaders who once gathered men for short raids now had to hold ground, settle disputes, and decide who farmed which fields. Authority followed harvests. A ruler who could promise land and protection kept warriors year-round and attracted neighboring households that preferred predictable dues to constant risk. Halls turned into hubs where tribute was counted and favors tracked. A man's place in that tally mattered. Those who fought close to the king's shield won plots near good water or along a ridge path that controlled movement. These grants stuck in memory and began to pass through families. Later tradition set a founder at the start, a figure whose name anchored claims to first rights. The stories cast him as a campaigner who forced openings against rival bands and Brittonic groups, and whose victories laid out the spine of the territory. Whether every march or battle happened as told is less important than the pattern the tradition preserves: consolidation by repeated strikes, defended settlement following conquest, and the habit of rewarding support with land. That pattern trained followers to expect continuity, and it taught rivals that the leadership could replace dead men without losing the field. Succession began to narrow. Instead of the strongest war leaders stepping up from a circle of near peers, sons and close kin took precedence. The hall itself helped tighten that circle. Feasts gathered witnesses, and gifts moved along lines that mirrored kinship. A claimant who could stand up in the hall and show the bracelets, weapons, and pledges his father had once displayed carried weight before he drew a sword. That did not end disputes. It framed them. Arguments shifted from who was the boldest to who had the clearest claim to the established stream of rewards. Early successors fought to keep the map from fraying. Campaign seasons stacked up as neighbors tested borders and local chiefs tried to peel off outlying estates. Kings led from the front because men followed the person who paid them, not an office. A raid that won cattle and captives repaired loyalty. A loss that cost trusted companions could break it. The king's household guard set the tone. If those men held firm, others stood fast. If they cracked, fields burned and markers vanished. In this phase, institutions were thin and reputations heavy. A weak season, bad harvests, a failed river crossing, a wound at the wrong moment could tilt the balance. Territory could shrink in a month, and recovering it might take years. That volatility made memory a tool. Deeds lived in songs, and names attached to places where a stand had turned the line. Families repeated these markers to justify claims to land and office, and to explain why a rival's promise mattered less than an ancestor's oath. By the early 7th century, the role of king looked different from a war captain's seat. Lineage placed a candidate at the center. Land grants bound his following, and regular gatherings acknowledged his place even when no campaign was planned. He still had to win, but victory fed a framework that outlasted his spear. The region recognized familiar meeting grounds, known boundaries, and a cadence of dues and service. Those habits turned scattered strength into a recognizable kingship, one that could weather a bad campaign and recover because the office had roots in land, line, and the expectation that rule would continue. Power began to cluster where rivers met fields. Across the south, several kingdoms learned the same lesson at once. Hold the lowlands, and you can choose when and where to fight. Rulers along the Thames, the Itchen, and the Hampshire Avon treated waterways as highways, staging points for boats, carts, and grain. Control of fords and meadows meant more mouths fed and more spears retained through winter. With that base, leaders turned short raids into longer pushes that aimed to keep land, not just seize goods. The old rhythm of hit and go gave way to planned seasons of pressure. Campaigns stretched across years, not weeks. Armies returned to the same crossing or hill year after year, wearing down neighbors and reorganizing who paid tribute. Sieges, even simple ones, appeared more often. A timber rampart thrown up, a watch kept on stores, and a bargain struck when hunger did its quiet work. Kings sought to break a rival's ability to recover by cutting into his core estates and removing his local allies. When a region lost its fortifiable sites or its chiefs, it slipped into the orbit of the victor and paid for the privilege of peace. Success on the field started to translate into rights that outlived the victory feast. Tribute became routine, not windfall. Overlordship meant the defeated ruler kept his seat but answered summons, sent hostages, and stood behind his superior's claims. This system created layers, a king with direct lands at the center, subordinate rulers on the edges, and trusted managers who ensured dues arrived. Authority took on a calendar, a route, and an expected tally. A man could point to the road his tribute traveled and the day it was due. In this climate, kingship shifted away from a leader's charisma alone. It became an office tied to places and names, backed by a retinue that outlasted a single campaign. Ancestry mattered because it promised continuity. The son who inherited the routes and the halls inherited the obligations that kept men loyal. He also inherited rivals and debts, but the idea that rule passed within a house stabilized succession. Conflict still flared, yet the frame held because people knew where to bring grievances and where to show service. Agricultural heartlands made this possible. A ring of rich fields could support craftsmen, horse breeders, and specialists who strengthened an army's punch. More grain filled more granaries, and that surplus translated into longer marches, larger musters, and the ability to keep watch in multiple places at once. The cycle fed itself. Land produced power, and power acquired more land. Kings who secured the best soils could pause fighting long enough to repair fences, redistribute plots to proven men, and shore up weak borders before the next campaigning season. Open conflict sat beside careful deal-making. Marriages stitched corridors between valleys, turning would-be fronts into shared estates. Negotiated submissions kept local elites in place under new terms, reducing resistance and keeping production steady. A dowry could secure a ford as effectively as a raid. Witnessed agreements locked in routes and clarified who answered whose call. These ties wove smaller polities into expanding spheres, where a dominant ruler set tempo and terms. By the early 7th century, southern England no longer looked like a level field of peers. It was a competitive arena with recognizable centers, defined tributaries, and rulers who claimed more than personal followings. The ground had been prepared for a single power to pull ahead, not through a single blow, but through patient control of land, routes, and obligations that others had already learned to accept. Power needed a wider frame than swords and harvests. Rulers began to look for authority that could link distant valleys and make obedience feel routine, not improvised. Religion offered routes that war could not. It promised shared rights, common calendars, and a moral language that made rule sound rightful as well as useful. Across southern England, kings who wanted steadier control saw value in a faith that carried scribes, rules, and ties to courts beyond the sea. At the start of the 7th century, a mission from Rome stepped onto Kentish soil with that package. It brought Roman Christianity back to a landscape where older rites held sway and late Roman habits had faded. The message arrived with habits of writing and ritual that could record decisions and fix them in memory. The new priests worked through gates that warriors respected. They sought audiences where tribute was counted, where witnesses gathered, and where a single decision could reach thousands. Augustine of Canterbury and his companions took a practical route. They focused on kings first. A royal baptism made a public claim that a ruler now stood inside a larger order, with allies, counselors, and a literature that stretched to Rome. A river or a hall witnessed the rite, and the court saw the king accept a new name and a new patronage. That act did not erase older beliefs or end local rights overnight, but it set the ruler within a network that could provide clergy, books, and rules for marriage, oath-taking, and sanctuary. This alignment shifted the toolkit of rule. A king with clerks could issue notices in writing, track gifts to churches, and confirm grants with a cross. He could invite envoys who recognized the same fasts and feasts, easing talks across borders. He could claim protection from distant allies and call on teachers for the royal household. Literacy served more than devotion. It preserved agreements and made memory portable. When a ruler changed, the page steadied the handover. Churches and monasteries followed conversion as anchors of learning and record. A minister near a royal center kept lists of estates and the terms by which they were held. Monastic schools trained boys to read the law codes and prayers that now framed a king's public life. Scribes copied calendars that synchronized labor and levy days, giving officials a clock that matched neighboring realms. In disputes, a charter or a book of rules could be brought into the assembly and read aloud, lending weight to decisions made before an altar as well as a crowd. The language of rule absorbed Christian ideas. Kings framed judgments as acts of right order, mercy, and duty. Genealogies began to include sacred themes that tied a house to providence. Oath-taking invoked holy places and relics, making perjury more than a social breach. Inside that frame, diplomacy gained new tools. A ruler could seal peace with the founding of a church, promote an ally's kin to a bishopric, or use a council to settle not just belief, but also borders and dues. From Kent, the pattern moved into neighboring kingdoms, carried by marriages, visiting clerics, and drawing power of royal courts that adopted the new style. Each realm adapted the forms to its own needs, but the effect was similar: written norms, shared festivals, and rising expectations of how a ruler should govern. As these habits spread, they sharpened rivalries. Kings who mastered the churchy arts could claim seniority over neighbors still leaning on custom alone. That edge prepared the ground for larger powers to assert reach, knowing that authority now spoke through homilies, charters, and a calendar as much as through spears. Power tilted toward the Midlands as the century turned. While southern courts learned to work with clergy and charters, Mercian rulers harnessed rivers and routes that threaded through the heart of the island. They treated the Trent, Severn, and their feeders as arteries for movement and supply, moving retinues fast and striking where valleys opened. Control of crossings, inland ports, and ridgeway junctions let them dictate tempo. Tribute came not as occasional gifts, but as scheduled payment, collected from neighbors who saw what happened to realms that refused. The message traveled along barges and pack trains as clearly as any envoy's words. Expansion followed the same logic year after year. Mercian armies pressed along navigable waters, secured a ford, placed a garrison, and demanded hostages. Subordinate rulers kept their seats, but sent men when called and paid dues on time. River tolls and market rights shifted to Mercian hands, starving rivals of revenue while filling the stores that backed the next push. A cycle took hold. Each acquisition funded the next season's campaign, and the network thickened until resistance meant isolation. In this climate, small errors, late payments, a failed muster, carried outsized costs. Wessex confronted that reality from the south. Its core around the Upper Thames and the Chalk Downs still offered food and men, but Mercian reach forced hard choices. West Saxon kings measured ambition against a neighbor whose armies could threaten multiple valleys at once. They accepted terms when needed, acknowledging seniority to avoid a ruinous fight, then used breathing space to settle their own borders and keep elites on side. Recognition of overlordship did not mean surrender of identity. It meant survival while the balance of force favored the north. Being drawn into the Mercian orbit reshaped decisions in Winchester and nearby halls. West Saxon retinues marched in campaigns they did not choose, and diplomacy had to account for a hierarchy that ran through Midlands courts. Royal progress adjusted to show deference when required and independence when safe. Gifts flowed up and down the chain: silver, weapons, and marriage ties that kept the peace without ending rivalry. In return, Wessex secured room to reorganize estates, confirm loyalties, and ensure that musters met headcounts even under pressure. Military strain exposed weak joints. A lost engagement could cost more than cattle or a strip of land. It could trigger submissions, hostages, and a public admission that clipped a king standing at home. Leaders who failed to protect borders saw local chiefs look north for favor. The answer in Wessex was to reduce these openings. Kings tightened the circle of trusted men, strengthened the household guard, and kept estate grants tied to service that could be audited. They invested in reliable lines of movement within the kingdom so small units could cover gaps quickly. Adaptation kept the dynasty intact. Regular assemblies stressed continuity through lineage, even when the external order placed another ruler above them. Clerks recorded grants and boundaries, so estates could not be peeled away by quiet pressure. Church ties anchored authority in forms that survived setbacks: oaths before altars, witnesses whose names carried weight across courts, and teaching that linked royal duty to moral order. These tools limited defections when fortunes dipped and gave rulers a base to rebuild after a concession. By the later 7th century, Wessex remained whole but overshadowed. It held its core, spoke with its own voice, and kept the machinery of rule turning while stronger neighbors set broader terms. That position, secure enough to endure, constrained enough to rethink, prepared the ground for a future shift when the routes, dues, and loyalties might align differently. Living under a larger power pushed Wessex to look inward. Rulers began to worry less about distant borders and more about whether orders could travel from a hall to a hamlet and be obeyed. That concern turned attention to rules, records, and routines that could hold when the king rode elsewhere. The goal was simple: make authority predictable. When men knew what injury cost, what service was owed, and who had the right to judge a quarrel, local fires did not spread into civil wars. Fields stayed planted, dues arrived on time, and musters filled without constant cajoling. This turn shows clearly during Ina's reign. He consolidated gains by setting down a framework that outlived a single campaign season. His court treated disputes as matters to be processed, not gambles of force. Landholding moved from memory to formula. Grants described boundaries by streams, stones, and established paths. If two men claimed the same strip, a known assembly heard the case, witnesses spoke, and a ruling fixed the matter. That process steadied elite competition. A rival had less to gain from private raids if a peaceful judgment could secure the same estate with fewer enemies made. Law provided a vocabulary for authority. Rules set scales of compensation for wounds, theft, and damage to property. They bound the worth of a person to payments that prevented blood feuds from spiraling. A killing could still demand vengeance, but the default moved toward settlement. Judges and elders weighed intent, status, and circumstance. The aim was order. Keep kin groups from bankrupting each other, keep work on track, and keep warriors ready for the frontier instead of stuck at home in vendetta. People learned the tariffs and adjusted conduct to avoid costs they could not pay. Obligations also took shape in writing and speech that officials could repeat. Free men owed service according to their holdings. A hide funded specific duties: guard work at a fortification, bridge repair, and days in the field when the king called. These demands aligned with the seasons, so harvests did not rot while men stood in arms. Administrators tracked who appeared and who did not. Failure carried set penalties, which meant the system punished shirkers without requiring a feud. The more regular the duty, the easier it became to plan defenses and campaigns. To make this work beyond the royal household, kings relied on local officers. Reeves collected dues, enforced judgments, and represented the center at the shire level. They called assemblies, gathered witnesses, and escorted envoys. Their presence gave the king eyes and ears where he could not be. In return, the crown protected their authority with written confirmations and public ceremony. When a reeve read a ruling aloud at a boundary stone, the performance itself made the decision harder to ignore. Communities learned to expect the reeve's visit and to prepare accounts and testimony. Christian practice shaped tone and procedure. Oaths swore by holy places and sanctuary rules set limits on pursuit. Penalties sometimes diverted payments to churches, binding moral breach to material loss. Feast days and fasts set predictable intervals for courts and levees, giving the calendar a shared rhythm. Preachers framed royal justice as a duty of care, not just an assertion of might. That language mattered when a judgment bit hard. A harsh fine sounded different when cast as restoration and peace rather than domination. By multiplying these small certainties, Wessex built strength that did not depend on a single victor's reputation. Law fixed memory. Offices carried orders. The treasury could forecast receipts and match them to obligations. Under strain from neighbors, a kingdom organized this way could bend without breaking, because habit continued the work when swords paused. After the mid-8th century, the kingdom faced stress it could not fully control. Pressure came from two directions at once: a stronger neighbor settling terms beyond the northern horizon, and a home front where loyalties thinned where succession looked uncertain. Assemblies still met, dues were still counted, and courts still spoke judgment, yet the room for independent decision shrank. Royal progress looked more ceremonial, less commanding. The court could issue orders, but the margin to enforce them with outside consent narrowed month by month. Mercian ascendancy framed every move. Campaigns from the Midlands disrupted trade routes that Wessex needed and intercepted dues that once filled its stores. Overlordship meant answering summons and accepting treaties drafted elsewhere. Concessions included hostages, tribute schedules, and restrictions on external alliances. Even when the South avoided open battle, the drain showed up in the ledgers. Fewer surplus animals for gifts, fewer warriors retained over winter, and tighter rations during campaigning season. A kingdom that had learned to plan now spent its plans on surviving another year. Inside the royal house, succession grew contentious. Lines of descent provided options when clarity was needed, and options calcified into factions. Each branch cultivated supporters among local elites with grants that bound loyalty for the moment and eroded the future store of royal patronage. Rival claimants sought backing beyond the border, trading promises for recognition. These deals looked smart in private and costly in public. When a claimant won with outside help, the price showed up as fresh obligations and a reputation for dependency that hardened doubts among the shire assemblies. Defeats on the field multiplied the problem. A lost ford or a broken shield wall did more than move a boundary stone. It signaled that the king could not guarantee safety, inviting neighbors to test the line and local chiefs to hedge their bets. Rebuilding cost grain, silver, and time, resources already thin after tribute and factional bargaining. Muster calls faced quiet resistance. Men turned up late, under-equipped, or with excuses tied to harvest needs. Officers who pressed too hard risked sparking feuds that the courts struggled to contain, while the royal household counted casualties and shortfalls. Administration did not collapse, but it lost reach. Reeves arrived at meetings to find witnesses missing or verdicts delayed until a more powerful patron weighed in. Law codes offered tariffs and procedures, yet penalties could not bite if offenders stood under a shield offered by a stronger outside lord. Charters continued to define estates and bounds, but enforcement relied on consensus that weakened when elite blocks aligned with different heirs. The written word stabilized memory. It could not by itself move a stubborn gatekeeper or compel a levy from a wary community. The wider balance of power stripped Wessex of initiative. Diplomacy aimed at avoiding disasters rather than shaping outcomes. Border adjustments became acceptable losses if they prevented harsher terms. The court emphasized continuity, public oaths, church patronage, careful observance of custom, to reassure subjects that rule persisted, even when it bent before Mercian demand. Survival became the strategy. It worked, but at a cost. Each year of compliance made it harder to reverse the flow, because habit conditioned officials and local leaders to think in narrower horizons. By the closing decades of the century, the kingdom looked smaller in ambition and thinner in resources. Its leaders guarded the core, trimmed expectations, and deferred risky campaigns. The mechanisms of rule still functioned, yet they functioned defensively. That posture kept Wessex alive long enough to face a different kind of pressure, one that ignored river hierarchies and tribute calendars and arrived on tides rather than roads. The next threat would not ask for hostages or staged submissions. It would test whether a kingdom of habits could hold when the horizon itself carried sails. Coastal warnings reached Wessex at the worst time. The kingdom still nursed losses from faction and Mercian pressure when longships began to appear on the North Sea approaches and Channel inlets. Crews moved fast, choosing tides that favored exit over pursuit. They watched for beacons, gauged response times, and shifted landing sites if horsemen gathered. The pattern looked unfamiliar to rulers who measured danger by march routes and fords. Shores that once served trade and fishing now hosted sudden violence that did not seek negotiation or tribute. Raids hit, loaded, and left before a levy could ride from inland halls. The men came from Scandinavia, drawn by stories that crossed trading networks. Sailors and merchants had talked for years about Britain's rich churches and scattered defenses. The raiders did not need large armies or supply wagons. They needed a steerable hull, a shallow draft, and crews trained to row hard against currents. Boats slipped up estuaries and beached beside storehouses, churches, and farm clusters. Monks and priests kept plate, books with bindings, and livestock for sale or alms. A small band could terrify a district, strip valuables, and carry captives without committing to hold ground. Early attacks concentrated on obvious targets. Islands and headlands with religious sites had wealth and little protection. Bells summoned prayer, not soldiers. Fortified towns were rare on these coasts, and the nearest garrisons stood days away. When local fighters gathered, they found the raiders already gone or waiting in positions chosen for escape. Timber buildings burned, and the smoke carried rumors inland faster than wagons could. That speed magnified the shock. Communities learned that a single error, a late sentry, a missing boat chain, meant losses that a court could not reverse with fines. The raids exposed a blind spot across English kingdoms. Local defense assumed warning time and known enemies who wanted land, status, or submission. These visitors wanted portable goods and leverage. Fear worked as well as fire. A display at one site could unlock gates at another when word of cruelty spread. Captives became currency, traded for silver or used to guide returns to soft targets. Rulers who expected to answer threats with assemblies found that decisions made on a hilltop did not catch a ship already on the tide. News moved through markets and monasteries. Messengers carried lists of places struck, relics lost, and leaders slain. Some reports overstated damage, others missed entire landings. The effect was the same. Councils shifted patrols toward river mouths, and coastal estates tried to keep boats ready for chase. Yet the sea obeyed different rules than roads. Weather covered movement, and channels offered more landing spots than riders could guard. The mental map of risk expanded from boundary ditches to horizon lines that changed with each gust. Sporadic violence thickened into a season. Crews returned along known routes, learned where watchfires blazed too late, and explored new inlets where resistance grew. Different bands began to time their strikes to strain levies that could not stay in arms all summer. A hit in one shire drew men away from another. When leaders pursued, they found empty water or a feint that pulled them toward mudflats where horses bogged and footmen tired. The cost of missteps rose, and local officers struggled to keep calendars for work, court days, and musters aligned. By the later decades of the century, the pattern was too persistent to dismiss. The raiders' reach bent inland along rivers and forced adjustments in harvest plans, church holdings, and storehouse security. They were not a passing storm. They were a new pressure that targeted weak links and taught crews to read the English coast as a manual of exits and entries. That force would test not only courage, but the very systems that held a kingdom together when the king was far from the shore. Storm warnings turned into daily duties. Longships moved from scouting to routine landings along bays and river mouths from Dorset to Kent, using tides and creek networks to slip past watchfires and outrun riders. Raiding parties learned where grain lay stacked after harvest, where herds watered at dusk, and which hamlets kept ferries chained for crossing. They returned to coves that offered clean exits and to estuaries whose mud concealed tracks by morning. Each season set a template for the next, and crews grew confident that Wessex could be probed almost anywhere the sea met a stream. What began as plunder shifted toward pressure. Bands came back to the same districts, sounded for weak points, and timed strikes against local fairs and gathering days when stores and people concentrated. They mapped sandbars, marked shoals, and tested current speeds, making inland reaches feel coast-like. Once ashore, detachments split, one to burn sheds and seize carts, another to block lanes that a levy might use. Leaders coordinated by horn and hand signals, regrouped at agreed bends, and vanished seaward before horsemen found a firm ford. The tempo beat local response by hours, not days. Kings and ealdormen tried to match that pace and found the system misfired. The Fyrd could muster men, but the call took time, and service windows were short because fields could not wait on rumors. A levy built for a set campaign season fit poorly against raids that arrived whenever a wind shifted. Commanders faced choices that all cost. Hold men too long and lose harvests, let them go and watch smoke rise the next week. The calendar designed for border wars with known neighbors could not catch fleets that wrote their own schedule. Coastal strips absorbed the first blows. Fishing villages and salt pans went up quickly because tools and stores lay in the open, and boats offered carriers for loot. Inland, monasteries and landed estates felt the shift even more. Their barns, libraries, and workshops had grown into reliable banks of value for a settled world. Now, those same assets drew prow-guided attention. Stewards learned that stone walls slowed fire but not theft of stock, and that moving valuables meant exposing convoys to ambush on roads the raiders had already scouted. Borders did not restrain these crews. They bypassed major halls to strike the undefended farm that fed it, then circled back to catch a lightly guarded bridge. If a shire gathered men at one crossing, the fleet rowed a mile upstream to another and landed behind them. Hierarchies did not impress men who judged a target by access and exit speed. A great lord's estate rated no more than a hamlet if its approach was narrow and its wharf shallow. That logic leveled status and exposed where the fabric of defense was thin. Repetition laid bare the gaps. Messages moved slowly between coastal reeves, inland ealdormen, and royal centers. Orders overlapped and crossed in transit. Some districts mustered twice for the same rumor. Others never heard a beacon because the storm drowned it. Bands of defenders lacked a common plan to rally at multiple points or to shadow fleets along rivers. When a leader improvised, success depended on luck and personal reach, rather than a shared system that could be repeated in another shire the next week. By the later 860s, the question had shifted from loss control to survival. Silver paid to recover captives did not buy safety. Burned storehouses meant lean winters and fewer men in arms. Markets shut, dues fell, and charters that marked tidy boundaries could not stop a keel. The kingdom faced a hard truth. Temporary musters and scattered watchposts would not hold against a pressure that flowed with tides and returned with practice. If Wessex meant to endure, it needed rules that moved like armies, and walls that doubled as markets and muster grounds, tools that turned reaction into readiness. The years after the worst raids forced a hard reset. Leaders in Wessex learned that scattered responses and short levies could not hold. Orders had to move faster, and someone had to own the line from a royal hall to every shire. That insight pushed a reorganization of command, with clear roles for who called musters, who held stores, and who judged failures. Estates near river crossings became staging sites rather than private refuges. Messengers rode fixed routes, and officers kept tallies of service that matched landholding to duty. The idea was simple: tie authority to a schedule and a map, not a mood. Momentum gathered under Egbert. He rose with a plan to end dependence on outside sponsors and to settle old disputes inside his council, not in neighboring courts. He called ealdormen to account, demanded headcounts that could be checked, and refused to let local power eclipse royal summons. When an officer failed to muster, land grants faced review. When he met his marks, he gained security for his heirs. That approach cut across old habits of patronage and recent fears born of defeat. Authority began to feel direct again, not filtered through rivals. Egbert pushed the fight outward. He met hostile coalitions on open ground and forced decisions that stuck. Success on the field mattered because it unlocked political leverage at home. Local leaders who had hedged during the bad years now found value in a court that set terms and kept them. Levies arrived better equipped because the promise of real gains and predictable payment replaced the scramble of emergency calls. The court tracked shares from plunder and ensured fair division. A reputation for order kept men in the ranks. Victories against neighboring kingdoms signaled a return to initiative. Each win broke an alliance or opened a trade route that had been blocked. Councils no longer framed the year around avoiding calamity. They planned how to secure crossings, ports, and upland paths that linked shires. Garrisons learned to hold choke points rather than chase rumors. Diplomacy followed war's path. Envoys traveled with terms that combined respect for local elites with firm expectations about tribute, hostages, and market access. These were not gestures. They were instruments that fed the next campaign and funded winter stores. Submission from rulers beyond the old borders changed Wessex's scale. Tribute arrived as measured loads of silver, livestock, and grain, tallied by officers who knew what each district could bear. The flow widened the court's reach without overstretching it. Instead of planting permanent garrisons everywhere, Egbert leaned on sworn compacts, seasonal presence, and the threat of a rapid muster if dues fell short. When he visited, he confirmed charters, heard cases, and left rules that made his absence less risky. Authority traveled in procedure as well as in person. Military success tightened political bonds. Landholders saw that the shield they paid for worked. Clergy noted that roads were safer and that rights granted by charter held under strain. In assemblies, witnesses who had once split along factional lines now backed judgments that kept supply lines clear and levies fair. That consensus made recruiting easier and taxation steadier. The center could plan. It paired experienced captains with new officers, spread reliable methods from one shire to the next, and built a common vocabulary for signals, marches, and camp discipline. By the early 9th century, Wessex had changed posture. It no longer absorbed blows and counted losses. It set timetables, assigned responsibilities, and pressed outward when conditions allowed. The kingdom was not free from danger, but it was organized to face it with confidence. That shift from reactive musters to coordinated authority turned survival into strength and prepared Wessex to meet the next wave with structure instead of hope. Confidence met a new scale of danger. Raiding seasons gave way to organized forces that landed, quartered and captured towns, and demanded supplies as if they planned to stay. Fleets coordinated with armies that moved inland along rivers and roadways, aiming to break governments rather than barns. They chose winter camps near trade nodes and used them to launch pushes that split shires from their centers. Local officers who once chased bands of raiders now faced garrisons that could not be outweighted. The goal was not loot, it was control of routes, markets, and the authority that set dues. Across England, that strategy worked. Kingdoms that had managed sporadic raids could not adapt fast enough to a foe that fought in sequences: land, hold, expand. Councils fractured, musters missed targets, and some elites made terms to protect their districts at the expense of the whole. One stronghold fell and exposed another. Boundaries drawn by charters meant little when command posts switched hands. By the time the pressure crested, Wessex stood as the last large power with a functioning court, its neighbors reduced, absorbed, or bargaining from a position too weak to help. Alfred stepped into that storm. He took the throne when authority had little room to maneuver, and when hostile forces occupied key crossings and winter quarters on West Saxon ground. Royal messengers rode through districts that measured safety by day, not by week. Stores ran thin, and trust ran thinner. Even reliable officers faced choices that bent duty: hold men too long and lose the spring planting, dismiss them, and lose the roads. The court kept the counters and met in the open, but enemy patrols could threaten the paths leading to those meetings. Early campaigns did not go well. Alfred faced armies that knew the land and had tested the response times of every shire. Defeats forced withdrawals that looked like unraveling. The king's following shrank to those who could move fast and accept lean rations. A period of hiding followed, a narrow thread of survival held by a few halls that still answered his call. He relied on terrain that broke pursuit, on contacts kept quiet, and on the memory of obligations that had not yet been erased by fear. The realm at large felt absent rule, yet the idea of rule remained. From that precarious base, Alfred rebuilt. He reconnected with local leaders who knew which paths were safe and which ferries could be seized. He set meeting points by landmarks that could not be moved and used short-timed musters that asked men to appear, strike, and return before fields suffered. He mapped enemy habits and looked for the moment when dispersed garrisons could not reinforce each other. When the opening appeared, he forced a stand and won space, not by chasing, but by making every enemy yield room on the routes that mattered. The victory stopped collapse. It did not erase winter camps or end demands from hostile forces, but it broke the sense that defeat must continue. Shires that had hesitated committed again. Carts carried grain under guard, and officers enforced duty without sparking local feuds. Alfred stabilized the core with terms that balanced pressure and protection. He accepted submissions were necessary and focused punishment where betrayal had cut supply lines. The court regained a calendar, and the army regained a plan. With survival came a shift in kingship. Alfred's authority no longer rested on inherited claim alone. It drew weight from the ability to endure disaster, rally scarce resources, and coordinate responses that fit the new kind of war. He made the crown a point of organization as much as a symbol. Men followed because the system worked under strain. That lesson set the stage for the next steps: rules that could move faster than raiders, and defenses that doubled as places to live and trade. Survival bought time. Reform spent it wisely. Alfred treated the close call as a mandate to rebuild the way the kingdom worked from the ground up. He started with obligation. The old levy gathered men for short windows and then sent them home to save harvests. That gap invited attack. He split service, so one part of the force stood ready while another returned to the fields, and a reserve cycled in behind them. Duty tied to landholding set numbers that officers could check. Missed days carried penalties that did not require feud to enforce. With a year-round roster, raids met resistance in weeks when kings once stood short-handed. Defense needed fixed points, not just marching columns. Strong places went up or were refitted at river crossings, road junctions, and market nodes. Each site held a garrison, a store, and a signal plan with neighbors. Roads linking these points received upkeep as a public duty, so carts and mounted messengers could move under strain. The map began to function as a lattice. If an enemy pushed up an estuary, nearby sites sent men across prepared routes and pinned the advance, while a larger field force assembled. Markets inside these walls kept life running, which mattered because a defended town that traded drew people in and supported its own watch. Command worked because offices reached farther than before. Royal agents counted hides, checked bridge work, and inspected stores as part of routine progress. They read out orders at assemblies and recorded who came, who paid, and who fell short. Authorities stopped bypassing awkward districts and instead made those districts legible. When an officer punished neglect, he could point to rules known in every shire. When he rewarded diligence, he did it in ways that bound families to places rather than to short-term favor. The center no longer guessed at capacity, it tallied it. The court itself changed tempo. Laws were restated and expanded with terms that matched the new demands of service, refuge, and payment. Royal instruction traveled in writing as well as by voice. Writs set expectations for sheriffs and reeves, and witness lists showed which nobles stood behind each decision. When boundaries were confirmed, clerks named streams, hedges, and stones so arguments ended on the ground, not in memory. Judges could call on text to settle disputes, and the same words could be read in another shire the next week with identical force. Learning served these aims. Alfred sponsored teaching so that clerks, reeves, and even some lay magnates could read and write in the language they spoke. He valued books because they preserved orders, treaties, and terms of service. Schools near royal centers trained boys for tasks of office, keeping accounts, copying charters, and composing notices that matched common forms. Monasteries regained roles as archives and scriptoria, not only houses of prayer. The more the court wrote, the less it had to repeat, and the easier it became to replace a fallen officer without losing what he knew. Taken together, these moves nudged Wessex from reflex to routine. A raid did not demand invention, it triggered procedures. A vacancy did not produce chaos, it moved a deputy up a list. Storehouses had targets to meet, roads had crews assigned, and garrisons had numbers to hold. Communities still felt strain, but the burden spread on a schedule that fit work and war. The kingdom that had once survived by improvisation now held shape in quiet months as well as in campaigning season, and that shape could resist shocks that used to break lines wide open. Reform turned outward. Wessex no longer measured success by holding its core. It set terms for safety across neighboring lands that still had councils, fields, and dues to protect. Defense became a standing condition. Officers treated every season as active, not a lull between emergencies. The aim was simple and constant: shape where an enemy could move, and keep supply lines open for those who still looked to the West Saxon court for help. That change radiated beyond the old borders and gave scattered allies something solid to align with. Fortified towns fixed this system on the map. Walls rose at river confluences, on ridgelines that watched key roads, and beside bridges that linked grain counties to coastal landings. Gates controlled entry points. Ditches and ramparts forced attackers to waste precious hours under missiles. Inside, markets ran under guard. Storehouses kept official reserves, measured and sealed. A garrison drilled to standard calls so reinforcements arriving from another shire could slot in without confusion. Each site stood near enough to a neighbor that signals could pass before dawn patrols finished their rounds. No raiding column could march far without being seen, measured, and met. The levy system matched the towns. Service rotated, and quotas tied directly to land assessments. When a beacon rose, local companies took the first contact, while relief units assembled on preset routes. Farmers did not abandon entire parishes. Detachments left in turns, and officers kept lists that showed who owed the next watch. Blacksmiths and carters had duties on the same schedule, so spear points and grain carts appeared on time. This regularly replaced the old scramble that left one district stripped while another waited for orders. The field army no longer drained the countryside. It balanced it. Control of movement counted as much as striking power. Patrols shadowed hostile groups along river paths, denying fords and bridging points, and steering the enemy into ground chosen in advance. Scouts rode ahead to fell trees across lanes, lift ferry chains, and spoil boat ramps. Pursuit aimed to tire and channel, not chase blindly. When a raiding force tried to break away, it found the next crossing barred and a garrison waiting on the far bank. Skirmishes wore them down, cut their carts loose, and made retreat costlier than standing to fight on poor terms. The sea received equal attention. Crews patrolled the inshore lanes from the Soylent to the Downs, working with pilots who knew sandbars and tide turns. Watchposts counted hulls and fired beacons in sequence, so a landing seen at one headland triggered a response 2 estuaries away. Small craft carried larger ships toward mud and shallow creeks where shore parties could strike as men disembarked. Boat sheds kept spare gear and repaired oars on calendar, so vessels were ready when weather broke. Ports inside fortified towns served as bases, linking naval alerts to land musters. All of this made authority visible. Stone and timber said the king had reach. Courts sat inside the walls, dues were weighed beside the gates, and writs were proclaimed in market squares where garrison captains stood as witnesses. People learned that safety and judgment occupied the same ground. A child born under those ramparts grew up with the sound of drills and toll bells as normal timekeepers. The message was not subtle. Order had a place and a plan. By the decade's end, the framework held more than Wessex together. Shires beyond its heartland aligned their watches, accepted patrol routes, and sent messengers along the same measured roads. When enemies probed, they met a pattern that did not depend on one hall or one man. The kingdom that once fought to stand now served as the shield for those who could still answer the call, and the name that rallied them sounded larger than its map. Stability at home created room to act. The fortified network, rotating service, and reliable stores that had held the line now freed leaders to choose where to apply pressure. Councils no longer spent each season guessing which inlet would burn. They planned routes, targets, and timetables beyond the older West Saxon core. The shift felt practical rather than glorious. Officers updated muster lists, assigned guides who knew border paths, and paired garrisons with mobile units that could hold ground taken in a week's push. Where defense had once absorbed shocks, the same machinery began to press outward along roads already kept for war and trade. Secure frontiers changed calculations in neighboring districts worn thin by years of disruption. Local elites faced a simple test: live with scattered authority and irregular dues, or sign on to a system that delivered courts, markets, and watch schedules that actually ran. West Saxon envoys arrived with terms that set tribute in measured loads of grain and silver, confirmed estates for those who cooperated, and promised swift help if raiders returned. The promise mattered because the signal network and roads could deliver it. Submission did not erase local identity. It capped it with rules that tied the district to a wider plan. Campaigns across old Mercian zones followed a deliberate pattern. Columns advanced along known river corridors, secured fords, and posted detachments rather than stripping the line bare for a single gamble. Officers counted bridges, boat chains, and storehouses as assets to be kept, not prizes to abandon. Towns that opened their gates kept their markets under new oversight. Those that resisted faced short sieges backed by field forces that could block relief. Once quiet resumed, tribute schedules replaced ad hoc levies, and local courts sat with West Saxon witnesses present to validate judgments and ensure dues reached the center. The pace stayed measured. Marriage alliances locked in new ties where arms had opened doors. Hostages guaranteed terms without draining garrisons. When a chief accepted service, the crown confirmed his holdings and named his obligations in writing, making the arrangement durable and legible to his neighbors. Officers avoided needless purges. Removing too many local figures risked harvest failure and empty forts. Preservation served policy. Keep production steady, keep watchposts manned, and fold new manpower into the levy without breaking the district that supplied it. Infrastructure built for crisis now carried advance. Burr roads moved carts and spearmen inland on schedules that matched beacon lines. Strongpoints served as depots for campaigns, so the field army marched with shorter tails and safer rest points. If an enemy countered, neighboring towns could quickly lift additional companies and block approaches behind the line. The result was reach without risking collapse at home. The same lists that once saved parishes from being stripped now allowed planners to draw evenly from multiple shires, keeping farms working while armies operated. Each annexed route increased capacity. New regions sent men on the same rotation and paid in forms the treasury already used. Smiths, horse breeders, and carters folded into a system that set quotas and kept tools ready. More grain filled the stores that fed longer operations, and more watch points extended the warning net. Expansion reinforced the very structure that enabled it, and the feedback loop tightened season by season. People who had weathered years of uncertainty found that stable dues and predictable courts brought more security than a proud but isolated independence. By the early 10th century, the kingdom's name meant a framework rather than a narrow map. The West Saxon heartland still held the crown and the archives, yet the rhythms of its law, levy, and market oversight pulsed across central and southern England. Districts aligned to its calendar, answered its writs, and trusted its signals. Authority now organized space on a scale that outgrew older borders, and the habit of looking to that center for order set the stage for a broader unity to follow. Stability in the south shifted attention toward the Midlands, where the maps of power overlapped with old loyalties. Mercia still held authority in name and habit. Its shires knew the drill of musters, dues, and courts, but its leadership had thinned after years of war and negotiation. Officers who once answered to a strong king found themselves guarding boundaries without a clear center. That weakness did not erase Mercia's importance. It made the region decisive. Whoever guided its assemblies and watched its river routes would set the next course for England as a whole. A moment of calm followed a death that might have sparked turmoil. Instead of a scramble, Mercia's authority moved through kinship and council into West Saxon hands, avoiding the costs of siege and sack. This transfer mattered because it preserved continuity. Market days stayed on schedule, reeves kept their ledgers, and local garrisons watched the same roads with new instructions. Consent did quiet work. Communities accepted orders when they saw familiar officers carry them, now backed by a crown with resources to enforce terms and defend borders already tied into southern defenses. Edward the Elder led with a notebook as much as a sword. He pressed where resistance lingered, but he measured gains by the towns that reopened their gates and aligned their beacons, not by one grand clash. Campaigns moved stepwise along river corridors and ridgeways, clear a crossing, repair a bridge, post a detachment, and bring the nearby burh into the signal chain. When a district submitted, he confirmed its lands and set quotas that matched what it could actually provide. The result looked steady rather than spectacular, which was the point. Town by town, the system absorbed territory. Former Mercian lands kept their faces while their muscles changed. Local elites sat in courts with West Saxon witnesses and used writs that matched forms known in the South. Dues shifted from ad hoc demands to scheduled tallies. Garrisons drilled to shared calls so reinforcements from another shire could fit in on arrival. The levy rotated under the same rules. A hide owed so many men for so many days, so harvests continued. This approach reduced friction. By keeping known figures in place and giving them clear obligations, the crown gained reach without breaking the districts that fed and guarded the line. With Mercia settled into this framework, focus turned north. Viking-held zones and independent rulers faced a different opponent than before. Instead of multiple kingdoms competing for allies, they saw a single southern power that could march, garrison, and negotiate in sequence. Fortified towns served as bases for advances. Roads linked supply to the front. Where resistance held, sieges tightened slowly while nearby districts were brought under rule. Where talks opened, hostages, oaths, and tribute replaced sack and displacement, making recovery faster and defections less likely. Diplomacy matched the method. Submission earned confirmation of lands. Alliance brought market access and protection. Recognition carried weight through shared ceremony. Councils met with mixed attendance, southern officers, Mercian nobles, and northern envoys, so decisions had witnesses on all sides. The language of agreements looked familiar across regions, which made enforcement easier and grievances simpler to hear. A ruler north of the line could accept terms without losing every local tie, because the framework respected working institutions, while setting boundaries the center could verify. By the mid-920s, the border between Wessex and Mercia had lost political meaning. The same beacons flashed across both, the same levy rules filled the ranks, and the same courts read out judgments with lists of witnesses that blended southern and midland names. People traveled under coins and tolls that matched on either side of older lines. Under that shared routine, talk of one English realm sounded less like a claim and more like a description. The path to unity ran through habit and schedule, and those now stretched from the Chalk Downs to the Trent without a break in the pattern. Power gathered by increments. The networks built across Wessex and Mercia produced a single chain of command that could pass orders from the south to the Midlands without breaking. Inheritance supplied continuity, while submissions and treaties closed gaps left by war. Local elites kept their courts and markets, but they now answered writs that matched a wider pattern. That kind of reach did not look like sudden conquest. It looked like calendars that aligned, beacons that flashed in sequence, and dues that arrived in the same weights and measures from shire to shire. This platform set the stage for Aethelstan. As Alfred's grandson, he received a realm that already stretched farther than earlier kings had managed. Even so, loyalties ran close to home in the north and west. Assemblies there respected long memories, and leaders guarded local rights. Aethelstan moved quickly to turn a broad claim into a settled fact. He visited strongpoints, confirmed land with precise bounds, and demanded hostages that guaranteed terms. Where influence existed, he formalized it. Where it wavered, he pressed until acknowledgement came in public settings with witnesses whose names carried weight across regions. By front-loading legitimacy, Aethelstan turned dominance into recognized authority. Rival rulers agreed to stand within his order rather than sit at its edge. Their consent did not erase their status, but it put their signatures under his title. That title marked a shift. Earlier kings exercised supremacy through practice, tribute, musters, and deference, yet the name of their office still pointed to a region. Aethelstan claimed a wider people. He presented himself as the king whose writ ran over English communities wherever they stood, not a manager of one heartland with satellites attached. Government followed the claim. Law codes were restated with terms that fit a larger realm, so that penalties, oaths, and procedures matched from the channel ports to river towns far inland. Coinage moved toward consistent design and weight, which simplified trade and tax collection and made the king's face and authority a daily sight. Charters named estates and boundaries in forms that scribes across multiple centers could copy and enforce. Royal officers circulated through mixed districts, reading writs in the same phrasing and taking account in the same units of land, labor, and payment. Abroad, the kingdom's standing rose with its scale and order. Envoys crossed to courts where shared faith and familiar paperwork eased negotiation. Marriages and treaties carried practical benefits, safe passage, recognition of borders, and channels for merchants who moved cloth, metal, and coin. These ties reinforced legitimacy at home. When neighbors treated the realm as a peer, local elites read that as assurance that backing this king protected their markets and their titles better than clinging to older, narrower claims. Force still mattered. Coalitions tested the new shape of power, hoping that unity would crack under strain. Aethelstan answered with campaigns that used the infrastructure already in place. Garrisons held crossings, supply moved along prepared roads, and field armies operated with detachments that could reinforce each other on signal. A major victory confirmed that the system could handle pressure from multiple fronts. The message was clear. Unity did not rest on words or ceremonies alone. It could be defended in the field and restored if broken. By the close of his reign, the realm worked as a single kingdom. Courts heard cases under a common frame, coins paid dues without conversion, and royal orders reached distant districts within a known time. Authority extended from southern harbors to northern bounds in one language of law and service. Local identities remained, but they lived inside a structure that organized defense, taxed fairly by schedule, and kept roads and markets open. The English king ruled more than accumulated lands. He held a working system that tied far places to a center they recognized as their own. Unity brought a new problem: keeping it. After the first English king's death, the crown did not command loyalty by momentum alone. Councils still met, writs still moved, and coins still changed hands, but the center had to prove it could hear distant shires and act quickly when trouble rose. The task turned inward: protect revenue, guard roads, and steady officers whose authority depended on the crown's ability to show up with orders and, if needed, an army. The calendar that once built a state now had to preserve it. Successors from the West Saxon line inherited reach and risk together. Their rule stretched from the southern ports to the northern frontiers, yet affection for local leaders remained strong. A missed payment in one district or a slighted ealdorman in another could slow levies and stall judgments. The kings learned to balance firmness with reassurance. They confirmed land with tight bounds, renewed oaths at well-attended councils, and made sure charters listed witnesses from multiple regions, so decisions felt shared rather than imposed from a single hall. Resistance persisted in the north. Former rival elites watched for hesitation and tested whether southern officers could keep pace in unfamiliar terrain. Edmund I answered with mixed methods. He moved quickly against hard refusals, restored lines around market towns, and posted detachments that secured bridges and ferries. At the same time, he rewarded compliance with confirmations that protected estates from predatory rivals. When force broke a revolt, administration followed immediately, recounting dues, resetting patrols, and bringing courts back on schedule so a conquered place did not drift back into disorder. Edred faced the same cycle and treated supply as strategy. He pushed field armies only as far as the system could feed them, avoided emptying shires of men during harvest, and leaned on fortified sites to hold gains. Hostages and tribute enforced terms, but paperwork made them durable. Writs named who owed what and where to pay it. Officers carried identical formulas from one district to another. By making obligations legible, he narrowed space for evasion and reduced the need to reconquer the same ground. Military authority and royal governance worked as one machine. Garrisons guarded crossings while reeves audited stores. Generals led columns while clerks recorded fines and grants that kept allies invested. The law gave courts a shared script, so rulings in the north matched those in the south. Patronage, appointments, gifts, and church support tied families to the order that protected their claims. Each lever reinforced the others. A judgment carried weight because a garrison could enforce it. A levy filled because the court distributed rewards fairly and on time. As years passed, the monarchy settled into an institution with layers: household officers, shire courts, fortified towns, and a church that taught obedience as a civic habit. That maturity stood out under Edgar the Peaceful. His reign did not revolve around spectacular victories. It rested on disciplined rule. He kept beacons, markets, and musters aligned, insisted on consistent coinage, and presided over councils that drew broad attendance. Stability under him looked like ships provisioned on schedule, bridges repaired without special orders, and judgments issued in forms any reeve could recite. By the late 10th century, achievement meant continuity. England functioned as one realm whose laws, coins, and summons reached from coast to upland without translation. The crown's authority survived transitions because the framework held shape when a ruler died, and the framework itself traced back to West Saxon habits. Law in clear language, service tied to land, and defenses that doubled as places to live and trade. England did not appear as a neat block on the map overnight. After unification, the West Saxon royal house found itself managing a realm that stretched far beyond its old boundaries, and every mile of new territory brought fresh problems. The royal court now had to think in terms of coasts, borderlands, and trade routes that crossed former kingdoms with their own customs. Authority needed to be present in places the king might never visit, and it had to feel consistent enough that distant communities treated royal commands as normal rather than exceptional. The achievement looked impressive, but holding it together required constant attention. Roads kept passable, fortresses supplied, courts convened on time, and orders carried out by people with no personal bond to the king. The heirs of Alfred the Great inherited his tools for the job, along with his worries. They ruled as kings of all England, and that meant organizing defense from the Channel harbors to the northern shires along the old Roman lines and the newer fortified towns. The crown leaned on the habits Alfred had set in motion: written instructions, a calendar of duties, and officials expected to deliver results. A king's itinerary became a form of governance, moving from region to inspect, confirm, and correct. The idea was simple: make royal presence routine, yet it demanded resources and an unbroken chain of trust. Law, taxation, and coinage gave that routine a backbone. Standard legal codes laid out penalties and procedures that courts in different regions could apply without reinventing them. Taxation worked to fund defense, maintain bridges and fortifications, and support royal household needs across the year. Mints operating under a common design and weight made trade more predictable, raised confidence in payments, and gave the crown a way to announce its reach on every coin in a market stall. When a merchant in York accepted the same silver as a reeve in Winchester, the system had done its work. Bringing former power centers into line required careful staffing. Mercia and Northumbria, once independent, came under appointment ealdormen and reeves who answered upward as much as outward. These officials balanced older local loyalties with the directives of a government that measured performance by delivery, tax collected, levies mustered, judgments enforced. Over time, regional magnates found their scope narrowed, not through sudden confiscations, but through procedure. Meetings happened on royal terms, documents bore royal formulas, and appeals climbed through channels that led to the king's court. Continuity made the machine run. Gaps threatened it. When a king died, claims multiplied. Brothers, sons, and distant cousins pressed their cases, and each had backers with local followings. Even a smooth succession forced the new ruler to secure acknowledgments from major regions, reissue charters, and confirm offices. Any delay encouraged holdouts to bargain or defect. The kingdom's youth showed in these moments, when the scaffolding of unity depended on how quickly the center could reassert itself. External pressure did not disappear. It learned and adapted. Viking groups reemerged with aims that went beyond plunder, shifting to settlement and bargaining for tribute that reallocated wealth toward those who threatened most. Sea kings and northern rulers backed claimants to the English throne, turning politics into strategy conducted by fleets. Tribute paid relief in the short term, but it set a price for peace that had to be raised again and again if defenses faltered. By the early 11th century, the word England meant a single political community with shared law, coin, and command. Its identity rested less on banners and more on habits, courts that met, officials who traveled, and taxes that arrived where they were supposed to. The House of Wessex had supplied the pattern, but the stress never let up, and each reign had to prove the pattern still held. Unity altered the job of ruling. With conquest receding kings had to make a single system run from the Channel past the Humber and into the border shires. That meant predictable courts, taxes gathered on schedule, and commands that carried weight even when the king had moved on. The early task was to turn victory into routine. Roads mattered because they carried officials and messages. Bridges mattered because they held levy routes together. Royal visits mattered because they confirmed oaths, punished delay, and reminded local elites that power now flowed from one center. Aethelstan set the tone. He used titles that asserted rule over the English as a people, not as a patchwork of provinces, and he behaved accordingly. He gathered magnates from across the realm, granted charters that named multiple regions in one breath, and issued law that assumed a common standard. Boundaries did not vanish, but they stopped defining separate worlds. When he demanded hostages from distant rulers or arranged marriages abroad, he acted from a position that expected obedience at home before seeking respect abroad. The message was simple. Kingship was single, not divisible. After him, that message needed constant reinforcement. The royal itinerary turned into a circuit that never ended. Kings moved with a household that could hear disputes, seal documents, and appoint or remove local officers on the spot. Progress meant visible authority. The king at a shire court, the king confirming property, the king correcting abuses. Negotiations sat alongside judgment. Pledges were renewed, sureties were taken. Peace was kept by tying people to deadlines and payments they could meet. Even success was temporary unless repeated, so the crown built patterns that trained regions to expect inspection. Government widened to fit the new scale. Councils grew larger, drawing churchmen and lay lords from many shires, and their acts named England rather than a single kingdom. Charters standardized formulae so rights looked the same whether granted in the south or the north. Law codes spelled out fines, procedures, and protections with an eye to uniformity, and they leaned on Christian norms to frame duty and mercy. A reader in one town could recognize the language used in another, which mattered because recognition is the first step to compliance. Military strength still served the crown, but more as a threat than a habit. Garrisons, levies, and fleets existed to make trouble expensive. Border friction with the Welsh and Scots required readiness. Scandinavian fleets returned at intervals, sometimes to test coastal defenses, sometimes to back claimants who promised tribute and access. Deterrence worked when response was swift, supply lines stayed open, and local commanders knew their roles. The point was not to conquer new ground, but to prevent unraveling. By the middle of the century, that approach paid off. Kings leaned on ceremony as much as on swords. Crowning rituals and public acclamations broadcast order. Coin types stayed consistent across mints, which told traders that royal oversight reached them, and told subjects that the king's face traveled farther than his body. Monastic renewal brought schools and scribes who kept records, taught officials to use them, and tied authority to written proof rather than memory alone. Confidence grew because the machinery worked. Edgar's reign showed the model at its best. Peace was not an absence of danger, but a system that handled it without panic. Regional leaders accepted graded status beneath a single crown. Oaths bound them, process guided them, and prestige drew them in. By century's end, the monarchy functioned as a continuing office embedded in church, law, and land. England looked familiar because its institutions endured from reign to reign, and the office of king had become the frame that held the realm together. From a fragile Saxon foothold to the foundation of a united kingdom, the House of Wessex reshaped Britain and forged the idea of England itself through survival, reform, and relentless ambition. If you want to see how power, war, and leadership continued to shape the English crown, subscribe now and join us as history moves forward.